He came shuffling down the street, mumbling to himself and making queer motions with his hands. I'll never forget those hands. I shuddered when I looked at them, how they opened and shut, opened and shut, opened and shut. I saw him look towards Francis and the others. I saw his thick grey hair and his drooping grey moustache. Everything about him seemed faded and grey. This was the description that Anna MacDonald gave of the strange man she'd seen shortly before her son Francis was abducted. Not long afterwards, Francis was found hanging dead from a tree in a wooded area near his house. He'd been severely beaten, sexually assaulted, and he'd had the flesh stripped from his left leg. The killer was a man named Albert Fish, and he wouldn't be caught for another 7 years. Anna MacDonald's eerie description earned him the nickname the Grey Man, but he was also known by other monikers: the Brooklyn Vampire, the Werewolf of Wisteria, the Moon Maniac, and the Boogeyman. To understand Albert Fish properly, you've got to look at his childhood. He poses an interesting problem for psychologists. As you'll see in this video, Albert was clearly deranged, but how much of his madness was inherited and how much was the result of his childhood mistreatment? It's the classic nature versus nurture conundrum. Born on May the 19th, 1870, to a mother who seems to have had some form of schizophrenia. She had a history of hearing voices and seeing things that weren't there, and it appears that mental illness ran in that side of the family. 7 of Albert's relatives had some sort of madness. Obviously back then psychology isn't what it is today. Most of them were diagnosed with some sort of mania. Exactly how this mania manifested itself isn't clear, but 2 of them died in lunatic asylums, so it must have been pretty severe. At the age of 5, Albert's father died, and with his mother unable to look after him, he was sent to St. John's Orphanage in Washington, and this is where the abuse started. The staff at the orphanage would badly mistreat the children in their care. One of the things they would do was strip one of the boys naked, then severely whip him in front of the other boys. This served not only as a physical punishment, but also as a form of humiliation. Little Albert was subjected to many such punishments, but something strange began to happen. He started to weirdly enjoy the pain of the beatings, and he enjoyed watching other children being beaten as well. He found that he would get physically aroused during the punishment sessions, which led to even more humiliation and beatings. This cycle of arousal and punishment left deep psychological scars, instilling within him both sadistic and masochistic desires. As Albert would later say, "That place ruined my mind." This combination of hereditary schizophrenia and severe childhood trauma was a toxic mix. As he reached sexual maturity, it manifested itself in strange perversions. Not only did he have a strong desire to experience pain and to inflict pain upon others, but also to eat bodily waste. Another thing he developed was an unhealthy interest in children. By the age of 20, he moved to New York City and became a prostitute. Between turning tricks, he would stalk the streets, looking for young boys who he would abduct and sexually assault. He targeted the very poorest neighbourhoods, knowing that crimes perpetrated against those on the bottom rung of society was less likely to be investigated, and so he was able to get away with it for decades. Exactly how far his sadomasochistic fantasies went at this point is unclear. It's not known when he started mutilating or killing his victims, but the seeds were definitely being sown at this time in his life. In a letter written by Albert, he tells a story about a friend who visited Hong Kong in 1894 during a great famine. The situation there, he says, was so bad that dead children were being cut up for meat, and his friend, being ever curious, actually tried some. Upon returning to New York, he regaled Albert with tales of how delicious human meat was, and so he became determined to try it for himself. I'm not sure whether this friend who visited Hong Kong ever really existed. It could very well just be a tale invented by Albert, but it gives us a vague idea of when he started to become interested in the idea of cannibalism, around 1894. This would have been 4 years after he moved to New York City, and by this point he'd probably abducted and molested hundreds of children. Considering he'd got away with his crimes up till now without any suspicion, he might have started to think about what other depraved acts he could get away with. At the age of 28, his mother arranged for him to marry a woman named Anna Mary Hoffman. Together they had 6 children. Although I assume it was a sham marriage kept up for appearance's sake. Albert had romantic relationships with loads of men while he was married to Anna, and he was still abducting children throughout. His relationship with his own children was bizarre, but there's no records of him actually abusing them himself. He would play strange games with them though. One involved Albert getting on his hands and knees and having one of his children sit on his back holding a long stick or a hairbrush. He would then tell them to hold up a hand and he would guess how many fingers they were holding up. If he guessed wrong, they would have to hit him on the behind with the stick. Apparently he always got it wrong, sometimes guessing a number higher than the amount of fingers they had on their hand. He would also serve up meals to his family consisting entirely of raw meat, then he would watch them eat it. This all seems part of his desire to consume human meat. Sometime in the early 1900s he developed a new interest. He visited a waxworks museum with one of his boyfriends, and there they saw an exhibit about tribal genital modification. He was particularly interested in a display of penile subincision. This is the act of splitting open the penis by cutting along it lengthways. Some tribespeople do it with sharpened rocks and no anaesthetic. I really don't recommend looking up pictures of it, but you can if you want. Albert Fish got really excited by this exhibit, and he became obsessed with the thought of genital mutilation. In 1910, he finally got to indulge his new fetish. He'd met a man named Thomas Kedden, and the two entered into a sadomasochistic relationship. It's not really clear how much of this relationship was consensual. In later confessions, Fish admits that Kedden was in some way mentally deficient and easily manipulated into performing bizarre sex acts. One day he took Kedden to an old farmhouse and subjected him to 2 weeks of extreme torture. Albert's account of this torture is way too long and graphic to describe here, but to give you an idea, he cut 3 switches from a blackberry bush and used the thorny branches to flay the skin from Kedden's buttocks. He starved him for days, then forced him to eat his own feces. He stuck an entire pack of needles into Kedden's genitals and buttocks and left them embedded in the skin overnight. He would also pour alcohol over his privates and set his flesh on fire. On the final day, he took out a butcher's knife, got Kedden aroused, and then sliced off half his penis. Albert would later recall, "I'll never forget his scream or that look he gave me." His intention was to murder Kedden, butcher his corpse and take the meat home to eat in private, but it was such a hot day that he was afraid the flesh would spoil and draw people's attention. Instead, he poured peroxide on Kedden's wounds, gave him $10, kissed him on the cheek and left. Nothing's known about what happened to Thomas Kedden after that. Fish never heard from him again, and nobody seems to have reported the crime to the police, so did Kedden bleed out and die somewhere near the farmhouse? Did he return home and, out of shame, never sought any help? We'll never know for sure. In 1917, Albert's wife left him for another man, taking all their possessions with her and leaving him to raise the children alone. As if Albert wasn't twisted enough already, this appears to have triggered a further decline in his mental health. He began to have strange auditory hallucinations, hearing voices in his head commanding him to carry out bizarre acts. The voices he heard started to take on a religious tone. He thought he was receiving instructions from the 12 apostles of God. He would go outside and shake his fist at the sky, screaming, "I am Christ," over and over again. He became obsessed with the idea of atoning for one's sins through pain, and Albert had a lot of sins to atone for. He started sticking needles under his fingernails and into his groin. Sometimes the needles he stuck into his groin went in so deep that he couldn't pull them out again, so he just left them in there. Years later, after Albert's arrest, they noticed that he couldn't sit down properly. He told them about his habit of sticking pins into his groin, but they didn't believe him, so they gave him an X-ray. Sure enough, embedded in his flesh and floating in his bladder, they found 27 separate needles. Another weird thing he enjoyed doing was to take some wool, soak it in lighter fluid, insert it into his rectum, then set it on fire. I honestly don't know how this guy didn't end up with sepsis or something, embedding needles in his bladder and setting his anal canal on fire. His aftercare seemed to consist of rubbing peroxide and Vaseline on the wounds. I guess he just had a really good immune system or something. This would also be a good time to introduce one of Albert's implements of hell, as he called them. This was a wooden paddle with nails driven through it. With this device, he would beat himself on the buttocks till blood ran down his legs. His other implements of hell were a meat cleaver, a butcher's knife, a cat of nine tails that he made from a leather belt, and a rusty handsaw. He carried these around with him, wrapped in a canvas sheet. Between 1917 and 1934, the depravity of his crimes increased in severity. He continued to abduct children, but now he started torturing and murdering them, then cannibalizing the remains. Exactly how many victims there are is unknown. After his arrest, based on his remarks, the interrogator guessed that there was at least 100 victims, but Albert laughed at this figure, putting it closer to 400. We'll never really know if this figure is accurate. Forensics of the time wouldn't be able to link much back to him, and we know that serial killers often exaggerate the extent of their crimes after being arrested. The first known victim was 9-year-old Francis McDonnell, who I covered at the start of this video. This happened in 1924. 3 years later, he claimed his next known victim, 4-year-old Billy Gaffney. On the 11th of February, Gaffney and his friend, 3-year-old Billy Beaton, were playing in the hallway of their apartment building. At some point, both boys disappeared, but later Billy Beaton was found hiding on the roof of the apartment. When asked what had happened to Gaffney, Beaton told the police the Boogeyman had taken him. Albert Fish took Billy Gaffney to an abandoned building and tied him up, then whipped him brutally with the cat of nine tails. Then, while the boy was still alive, he cut off his ears and nose, sliced his mouth from ear to ear, then gouged out his eyes. After that, the boy was dead, so he butchered the body, keeping the parts he wanted and throwing the rest in a ditch. In a letter to his attorney, Albert describes in sickening detail what he did with the meat afterwards. "I made a stew out of the ears, nose, pieces of his face and belly. I put onions, carrots, turnips, celery, salt and pepper. It was good. I then split the cheeks of his behind open. I put strips of bacon on each cheek of his behind and put it in the oven. I then picked 4 onions, and when the meat had roasted for about a quarter of an hour, I poured about a pint of water over it for gravy and put in the onions. At frequent intervals, I basted his behind with a wooden spoon so the meat would be nice and juicy. In about 2 hours it was nice and brown, cooked through. I never ate any roast turkey that tasted half as good as his sweet fat little behind did. I ate every bit of the meat in about 4 days." The next and last known victim was 10-year-old Grace Budd. In 1928, Albert saw a classified ad that read, "Young man, 18, wishes position in country. Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street. Seeing a chance to claim an easy victim, Albert wrote to the family and then visited them. Introducing himself as Frank Howard, he said that he was a farmer that wanted to hire Edward to do some work for him. His real intention was to abduct Edward, torture and murder him. Albert quickly gained the trust of the family. Promising a job for Edward, he went away and returned a few days later with a gift of strawberries and pot cheese for the family. He told them that it was produce from his farm. The family invited Albert in for dinner, and this is where he met Grace Budd. She came in, sat upon his knee and kissed him on the cheek. Upon meeting her, he immediately changed his mind about murdering Edward and decided to take Grace instead. He made up an excuse about having to attend his niece's birthday party and asked if Grace would like to come with him. The impoverished Budd family, eager to please Albert, agreed to let him take their daughter, and so they watched him lead her away down the street. This would be the last time that they ever saw her alive. He took Grace on a train, heading to an abandoned house in the countryside. When the train arrived at the station, Albert got off in a hurry, but Grace, being the kind and helpful soul that she was, spotted that he'd left a parcel behind on his seat and ran to retrieve it for him. This was the canvas sheet containing his implements of hell. Once they were at the abandoned house, Albert told Grace to wait outside for a few minutes, then come up to the bedroom. He went inside, laid out his implements on the bed, and stripped naked. When Grace came in, she screamed and tried to run away, but Albert was fast and he quickly overpowered her. Exactly what he did with Grace is not known. He confessed all to the police, but the details were considered too shocking to release to the public. All that's known for sure is that he strangled her to death, drained her blood into a paint can, and then butchered and ate her remains. When Grace didn't return home that night, her family alerted the police, but as Albert had given them a fake name and address, they were unable to identify him. 6 years after her disappearance, the Budd family received a strange letter. It was from Albert describing how he'd taken Grace from them, killed her and cooked her body. He told them how delicious her meat had tasted. At first it was believed to be a hoax. Years before this, they'd received a hoax letter claiming that Grace was safe and well, but this time something seemed different. Details like mentioning the gift of strawberries and pot cheese, things that couldn't have been known by anyone except her abductor. Analysis of the handwriting compared to the one that Albert had sent when he first visited the family confirmed that it was indeed from the man who had taken Grace. On the envelope was a logo representing the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. This was the first real lead that the police had. It led them to a janitor working at the Chauffeurs Association, and he said that he'd taken some of the envelopes and left them at a room at a boarding house before he moved out. The next person to occupy this room was Albert Fish, and this is how police finally caught him. Upon his arrest, he confessed it all, sickening his interrogators with detailed accounts of his crimes. His trial took 10 days. He pleaded insanity, telling the court how voices in his head had told him to kill. His defense pointed to the sheer depravity of his crimes as evidence of his mental instability, but no matter how crazy he actually was, it was clear that people wanted to see him fry. The jury found him sane and guilty, and he was sentenced to the electric chair. In Albert's final days, he seemed quite excited about the prospect of his death. He told the prison guards, "What a thrill it will be if I have to die in the electric chair. It will be a supreme thrill, the only one I haven't tried." On January the 16th, 1936, Albert was strapped to the chair, and after 2 jolts of electricity, the grey man was dead. There are rumours that the needles in Albert's groin caused flying blue sparks and made the chair short-circuit, but this has been disputed as mere urban legend, so I can't say for sure if that's true. In the end, he'd only been charged with 1 murder, that of Grace Budd. The 2 others he confessed to didn't have enough evidence to convict him. He was a suspect in about 10 other murders, but again the evidence was never strong enough to be sure. his true body count will never truly be known. Thank you for watching the video. It's a bit of a rough one this week, but I don't believe in filtering out details of a crime. I mean, what's the point in making a killer sound less evil than they really were? Anyway, thanks to everyone who's supporting the channel. Without my Patreon, I'd have to make all my videos kind of family friendly and no one wants to watch that, so thanks to all of you, I really do appreciate it. If you found this video informative, then here's some others you might like. Check them out if you think you can stomach another one. Until next time, goodbye.